The bridge gave way with a sound like a gunshot cracking through the storm. Clara Bennett was standing knee-deep in river reeds, gathering rushes for her mother's baskets, when the wooden planks above her twisted and dropped into the churning water. A carriage went with them. Horses screamed. Wood splintered against rock, and a man's body was thrown clear of the wreckage, tumbling into the flood like a doll tossed by an angry child. She did not think. She dropped the rushes and ran along the bank, her boots sinking into mud, her skirt dragging heavy and wet against her legs. The current was fast that week, swollen from 3 days of rain, and it was already pulling the man downstream, his coat ballooning around him like a dark sail. Clara had grown up on this river. She knew where it slowed near the bend by the old mill, and she knew that if she did not reach him before that bend, the water would pull him under the fallen timbers and he would not come up again. She went in without a rope, without a plan, without stopping to think about the cold that closed around her legs like iron. The current hit her harder than she expected, spinning her sideways, filling her mouth with water that tasted of mud and rain. She kicked toward the man, reaching, missing, reaching again. Her fingers finally closed around the collar of his coat just as the current tried to drag him past her. He was heavy, heavier than any sack of grain she had ever hauled from the barn. She hooked her arm under his and kicked toward the bank with everything she had, her lungs burning, her ears full of the roar of water and her own heartbeat. The bank came up too fast. She hit it hard, scraping her arm against a root, but she did not let go. She dragged him up onto the mud, both of them gasping, both of them shaking. For a moment she thought he was gone. Then he coughed. River water came up in a rush, and he turned his head and retched into the grass, and Clara sat back on her heels, soaked through, her chest heaving, watching a stranger claw his way back into the world. He was better dressed than any man she had ever pulled out of a river. His coat, even ruined, was the kind of fine wool that cost more than her family earned in a season. His boots were leather, polished once, now caked in mud. When he finally opened his eyes, they were pale gray, and they fixed on her with a confusion that slowly sharpened into something else. "You," he said, his voice raw, "you pulled me out." "Don't thank me yet," Clara said, still catching her breath. "You might have swallowed half the county." He laughed. It turned into a cough and he winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. "That might be true." "Don't move. Something's wrong with your side." "Several things are wrong with my side, I imagine." He tried to sit up anyway and hissed through his teeth and lay back down in the mud without further argument. "Where is my driver?" Clara's stomach turned cold. She looked back toward the collapsed bridge, at the wreckage of the carriage caught against the rocks, at the horses still thrashing in the shallows further down. There was no sign of another person. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I saw you fall, I didn't see anyone else." His face changed. Whatever pain he had been hiding behind dry humor disappeared, replaced by something urgent and afraid. He tried to rise again, and this time Clara put a hand flat on his chest to stop him. "You can't help him like this," she said. "You can barely breathe." "Then help me stand, and I will breathe badly while I look for him." There was no arguing with that tone. She had heard it before, from men who owned the land her family farmed, men used to being obeyed without question. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that was not command but fear for another person, and that made her decide to help him rather than resist him. She got him upright, his arm slung over her shoulder, and together they staggered along the bank, shouting the driver's name into the rain. It was Clara who spotted him first, caught in a tangle of fallen branches near the mill, his leg pinned but his head above water, coughing and cursing in a way that told her with great relief that he was very much alive. It took the better part of an hour, with the stranger directing and Clara doing most of the physical work, to free the driver from the branches and drag him to solid ground. By the time it was done, all three of them were coated in mud and shaking with cold, and the rain had finally begun to ease into a thin gray drizzle. "You saved his life too," the stranger said, watching Clara wrap her own shawl around the injured driver's shoulders because it was the only dry thing left. "You saved us both." "I did what anyone would have done." "No," he said, and there was no humor in it now. "You did not. Most people would have run for help and prayed it arrived in time. You went into that water without a rope, without knowing who I was, without any reason to believe you would survive it yourself." Clara looked at him properly for the first time since pulling him from the river. Now that the panic had faded, she could see him clearly. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair plastered flat against his forehead, and a face that, even bruised and pale, held itself with an unmistakable air of authority. And there, on his ruined coat, half hidden by mud, was a crest she recognized from every church pew and market notice in the county. The wolf and the oak tree, the mark of the Ashworth family. Her stomach dropped. "You're the Duke," she said quietly. "Edward Ashworth," he confirmed, though at this precise moment I would settle for being called anything that did not also require me to stand up straight. Under any other circumstance, Clara might have curtsied, might have stammered an apology for speaking to him so plainly, might have remembered her place the way her mother had drilled into her since childhood. But she was soaked through, exhausted, bleeding from a scrape on her arm, and she had just spent the better part of an hour hauling a Duke and his driver out of a flooding river with her bare hands. There did not seem to be much room left for ceremony. "Well, Your Grace," she said, "you should still sit down before you fall down again." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, she thought, or perhaps something closer to amusement. "What is your name?" "Clara Bennett." "Clara Bennett," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same." "I have lived among a great many people who would not have," he said, and there was a weight behind the words that Clara did not yet understand, though she would come to understand it, painfully, in the months ahead. Word of the accident reached the manor before the three of them did, carried by a farm boy who had seen the wreckage from the high road and run the whole way. By the time Clara helped the Duke and his driver up the muddy path toward Ashworth Hall, a small crowd of servants had already gathered at the gates, and among them stood a woman whose bearing left no doubt as to her identity. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashworth was tall, silver-haired, and dressed even at that early hour in black silk that seemed untouched by weather or worry. Her eyes swept over her son's ruined clothes, his pale face, the blood at his temple, and then settled with cold and careful precision on Clara. "Who is this?" she asked, in a voice that made the question sound like an accusation. "This," Edward said, his hand still braced against Clara's shoulder for support, "is the woman who saved my life." The dowager's expression did not soften, but something behind her eyes sharpened with interest, the way a hawk's does when it spots movement in the grass. "Is that so?" she said. Clara felt, in that single moment, the full weight of a divide she had never before had reason to think about so closely. The distance between a farmer's daughter and a duke's mother was not measured in miles. It was measured in something far harder to cross, and though she did not yet know it, that distance would shape everything that followed, for better and for very much worse. The physician was sent for. The driver was carried to the servants' quarters to have his leg set, and Edward Ashworth, 7th Duke of Rothmere, was helped inside by 2 footmen who fussed over him like hens with an injured chick, while he twisted around twice to look back at the muddy, exhausted young woman standing at the gate, as though he could not quite bring himself to let her out of his sight. "See that she is given dry clothes," he called back to the housekeeper, "and that she does not leave before I have spoken with her properly." Clara stood at the gates of a house grander than any she had ever set foot in, dripping river water onto the gravel, and felt for the first time a curious, uncomfortable pull toward a life she had never once imagined for herself. She did not know yet that the bridge she had watched collapse had not fallen on its own. She did not know that somewhere in the shadows of that grand house, someone had been counting on the Duke not surviving the crossing at all. And she certainly did not know that the storm which had swept her into that river would prove to be the gentlest thing that would happen to her in the year ahead. The rain had stopped by the time she was given a room to change in, but far away, in a narrow office at the back of the house, a man stood at a window watching the last of the gray clouds drift east, his jaw tight with an anger he was careful not to let anyone see. The bridge had held for 11 years without so much as a loose plank. It had chosen, of all days, this one to fail. 3 weeks passed before Clara set foot inside Ashworth Hall again, and when she did, it was not by her own choice. A letter arrived at the Bennet farmhouse, sealed with the wolf and oak crest, carried by a rider who did not dismount long enough to be offered water. Her father read it twice at the kitchen table, his face unreadable, before sliding it across to her without a word. The Duke of Rothmere requested the presence of Miss Clara Bennet at Ashworth Hall to discuss a matter of gratitude that could not, the letter said, be properly settled through correspondence alone. Her mother wanted her to wear her Sunday dress. Her father said nothing at all, which frightened Clara more than any lecture could have, because her father was not a man who stayed silent without reason. "You knew him," she said, watching her father fold his hands the way he did when he was choosing his words with great care. "Before, didn't you?" "I knew the family," he said. "A long time ago. Wear the blue dress, Clara, and do not stay past dark." He offered nothing further, and she did not push, though the strangeness of his answer sat with her the whole ride to the hall, tucked in the back of a farm cart borrowed from a neighbor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ashworth Hall looked different in dry weather. Where before it had loomed gray and forbidding through the rain, now it stood pale gold in the afternoon sun, its windows catching the light like rows of watching eyes. A footman met her at the gate this time, formal and expressionless, and led her not to the kitchens, where she had assumed she would be received, but through the front doors and into a sitting room so grand that Clara found herself afraid to touch anything, including the chair she was offered. Edward Ashworth was already there, standing by the window, and though the bruises on his face had faded to faint yellow shadows, he still moved carefully, one hand occasionally drifting to his ribs. "Miss Bennet," he said, and there was real warmth in it, enough that Clara's nervousness eased just slightly. "Thank you for coming. Your letter did not read like an invitation I could decline." A corner of his mouth lifted. "That was somewhat the intention. My mother believes gratitude is best expressed through a purse of coins and a swift goodbye. I disagree." "What do you believe, Your Grace?" "I believe a debt of this size deserves more thought than that." He gestured to the chair across from him, and when she sat, he did too, moving stiffly. "I would like to know the woman who saved my life, not simply thank her and send her away." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that she began cataloging the room instead. The paintings of stern-faced ancestors, the fire crackling though the day was mild, the small clock on the mantel ticking with a precision that felt almost accusing. "How is your driver?" she finally asked, because it seemed safer than any question about herself. "Mending. His leg will heal, though the physician says he will walk with a limp from now on." Edward's expression darkened slightly. "He tells me the bridge gave way beneath the wheels before it collapsed further, not simply weakened by rain, but broken, as though something had already been done to it." Clara felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You think someone did this on purpose?" "I think," Edward said slowly, "that a bridge which has carried carts and carriages for 11 years without incident does not simply choose the one day I am crossing it to fall apart entirely." "Who would want to hurt you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the fire. "There are men in this family, Miss Bennet, who believed the title should have passed to a different branch of the tree. My cousin Charles, in particular, has never made a secret of his opinion that I am not fit to hold Rothmere. Whether opinion has become something more, I cannot yet say. That sounds like a dangerous thing to say aloud. It is. He looked at her then directly, in a way that made her feel suddenly and uncomfortably seen. Which is precisely why I have said it to almost no one, and why I find myself, strangely, willing to say it to you. The visit that had been meant to last an hour stretched into the whole afternoon. Edward asked about her family, her father's farm, the river she knew so well she could navigate it blind. Clara found herself answering honestly, more honestly than she meant to, right up until his questions turned, gently, toward her father. "Bennett," he said, turning the name over, "it is familiar to me somehow. Has your family always farmed this land?" Something in Clara went very still, though she kept her voice light. "As long as I can remember." "And before that?" "Nothing worth telling," she said, the words coming out faster and firmer than she intended, and she watched him notice it, watched the flicker of curiosity in his eyes that told her he had caught the edge in her voice even if he did not yet understand its cause. He did not push. He only nodded and let the subject drop, though Clara suspected, correctly, that he had simply filed the moment away rather than forgotten it. When she left that evening, later than her father had wished, Edward walked her to the gate himself, refusing the footman's offer to escort her instead. "I would like you to come again," he said, standing in the cooling evening air, the last of the sunset turning the stone of the hall a deep rose gold. "Not out of obligation. I find I simply prefer the conversation." Dukes do not usually prefer the conversation of farm girls. "This one does," he said simply, and there was nothing performed in it, no practiced charm, only a plain and startling honesty that Clara did not know how to answer. She rode home in the dark, breaking her father's one instruction, turning Edward Ashworth's words over and over until they had worn smooth as river stones in her mind. The visits continued through the following weeks, each one longer than the last. Clara came to know the rhythms of the great house, the servants who greeted her with increasing warmth, the gardens where Edward, still recovering, preferred to walk slowly rather than sit indoors. She came to know his humor, dry and quick, and the careful way he chose his words when speaking of his father, who had died 3 years earlier and left him a title heavier than he had expected. She also came to know his mother's growing displeasure, worn thin and polite over a simmering disapproval that needed no words to be understood. "You are aware," Margaret Ashworth said one afternoon, catching Clara alone in the hallway as she waited for Edward to finish a meeting with his steward, "that gratitude has a natural end point. Most people understand this instinctively." "I have not asked for anything, Your Grace." "No," the Dowager agreed, studying her with an expression that gave nothing away. "You have simply allowed yourself to be asked. There is a difference, though I wonder if you see it." Clara held her gaze, refusing to look away first, though her heart was pounding. "I came here because your son invited me. If you wish it to stop, I imagine a word from you would end it far more effectively than anything you could say to me." Something shifted in the Dowager's face, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps," she said, "you are not entirely what I assumed." And she walked away before Clara could decide whether that had been an insult or, strangely, something closer to praise. It was on one of those visits, nearly 2 months after the accident, that the second danger arrived, quiet and almost unnoticed, the way real danger often does. Clara had come early, before Edward expected her, and found the stable yard empty, except for a groom she did not recognize crouched near Edward's favorite horse, a gray gelding named Storm that Edward rode every morning without fail. The groom straightened quickly when he saw her, mumbled something about a loose shoe, and left before Clara could ask his name. She would have thought nothing more of it except that Storm's saddle, when she glanced at it out of habit born from years of tending her own family's horses, sat strangely on the animal's back. She had grown up checking girths and buckles since she was old enough to walk, and something about the leather near the stirrup looked wrong, frayed in a way that leather did not fray naturally, cut partway through and left to look worn rather than deliberately damaged. Her stomach turned cold. She found Edward in the study a few minutes later, going over correspondence with his steward, and interrupted without apology. "Do not ride Storm this morning," she said, before he could greet her properly. He looked up, startled by the urgency in her voice. "Clara, whatever is." "The stirrup leather has been cut, not worn through, cut and then left to look like ordinary wear. If you had ridden him at any real speed and put your full weight into that stirrup, it would have given way." The color drained slowly from his face as the words settled. His steward, a quiet man named Peter who had served the family for over a decade, went very still as well. "Show me," Edward said. They found the damaged saddle exactly where Clara had left it, and when Peter examined the leather closely, his expression confirmed what Clara had already suspected. It had indeed been cut, cleanly, with something sharp, and then artfully frayed at the edges to disguise the work. "Who had access to the stables this morning?" Edward asked, his voice tightly controlled in a way that told Clara he was holding back something far less controlled underneath. "Half the staff, Your Grace," Peter admitted, "and your cousin arrived late last night. He took a walk before breakfast alone." Edward said nothing to that, but his jaw tightened, and Clara understood in that moment that whatever quiet suspicion he had voiced to her weeks earlier about the bridge had just hardened into something far closer to certainty. "You saved my life twice now," he said quietly, once Peter had gone to have the saddle removed and the groom questioned. "Once from a river, and once from a horse I would have trusted with my life without a second thought." "I only noticed a strap." "You noticed what no one else thought to look for," he corrected. "That is not a small thing, Clara." He was standing very close to her by then, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and for a moment neither of them moved, the study around them gone quiet except for the distant sound of horses in the yard and Peter's low, urgent voice questioning a groom who suddenly could not be found anywhere on the grounds. "I do not know what I would have done," Edward said, "if you had not been here this morning." "You would have found another way to nearly get yourself killed, I imagine," Clara said, though her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. "You seem to have a talent for it." He laughed, and the tension between them broke just enough to let both of them breathe again, though something had shifted, something neither of them said aloud, an understanding that whatever this was between them had grown roots too deep to easily pull free. That night, riding home in the dark once more, Clara found herself thinking not of the danger, though it frightened her more than she let herself admit, but of the warmth in Edward's eyes when he had looked at her in that study, as though she were something rare and worth protecting rather than a farmer's daughter who happened to be useful. She did not yet know that the same danger circling Edward Ashworth was about to circle far closer to her own family than either of them could imagine, and that the answers to who wanted him harmed were tangled, in ways neither of them suspected, with the very secret she had been guarding since the day they met. Somewhere on the estate that night, a man stood in the dark stable, staring at the empty space where a damaged saddle had hung only hours before, and understood with cold and growing fury that his first attempt had failed, and that a farmer's daughter with sharp eyes had become a problem he had not planned for at all. Charles Ashworth arrived at the hall for what he called a family visit, though no one, least of all Edward, believed the timing was coincidence. He was a tall man, several years older than Edward, with the same dark Ashworth hair but none of the warmth that softened his cousin's features. Where Edward's authority came naturally, worn easily like a coat that fit him well, Charles seemed to perform his, standing straighter than necessary, speaking louder than the room required, as though he were constantly proving something to an audience only he could see. He greeted Clara, when they were introduced over dinner, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "So this is the young woman who has caused so much talk in the village," he said, his tone light, though his gaze moved over her with an assessment that made her skin prickle. "The girl who pulled a duke from the river. How very dramatic." "It did not feel dramatic at the time," Clara said evenly. "Mostly it felt cold and frightening." "Modest, too, how refreshing." Charles's smile widened, though it still did not warm. Edward has always had a taste for refreshing things. New horses, new tenants, new causes to champion. "Charles," Edward said, a warning threaded through the single word. "I meant nothing by it, cousin." Charles raised his glass in a small, mocking toast, merely an observation. Clara said nothing further through the rest of the meal, though she felt Charles's attention return to her again and again, weighing, calculating, the way a man might study an unfamiliar animal to decide whether it was dangerous. She mentioned none of this to Edward directly that evening, not wanting to add fuel to a fire already burning between the two men. But she found Peter in the hallway later, on her way to collect her shawl before the ride home, and asked him quietly what he knew of Charles Ashworth. Peter's expression grew careful in a way that told her he had already decided to be cautious with his answer. "He was raised believing the title should have passed through his father's line," Peter said. "There was a dispute many years ago over the succession. His Grace's father won that dispute fairly, but Mr. Charles has never fully accepted it. He visits perhaps twice a year, always when money runs short, and always leaves in worse temper than he arrived." "Do you believe he could have damaged the bridge, the saddle?" Peter's silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. "I believe," he finally said, "that His Grace should not ride alone until we understand more, and I believe, Miss Bennet, that you would do well to be careful yourself. A man desperate enough to harm a duke may not think twice about harming anyone standing in his way." The warning settled into Clara's chest like a stone, and she carried it home with her that night, turning it over long after she should have been asleep. It was 3 nights later that she nearly proved Peter right. She had stayed at the hall past dark again, against her better judgment, drawn into a conversation with Edward in the library that neither of them seemed able to end. When she finally left, walking the long path toward the stable yard where a cart waited to carry her home, she heard voices near the far stables, low and urgent, carried on the still night air. She should have kept walking. She knew that even as she stopped, even as she crept closer along the shadow of the hedge, driven by an instinct she could not fully explain. Charles Ashworth stood near the carriage house with a man Clara did not recognize, a stranger in traveling clothes with a horse tethered nearby, saddled and ready to ride at a moment's notice. "The next attempt cannot fail as the last one did," Charles was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I do not care how it is done. An accident on the road, a fall from a height, something that leaves no question marks for anyone clever enough to ask them." "That will cost more," the stranger said. "The girl complicates things. She notices too much." "Then perhaps the girl needs to stop noticing," Charles said, and something in his tone made Clara's blood run cold. She must have made some small sound, a sharp intake of breath, the shift of her weight against a fallen branch, because Charles's head turned suddenly toward the hedge where she stood frozen. "Who's there?" Clara did not wait to find out what would happen if he found her listening. She turned and ran, her heart slamming against her ribs, her feet finding the dark path more by memory than sight, branches catching at her skirt as she pushed through the hedge and out onto the open lawn. Behind her, she heard Charles shout something to the stranger, heard hurried footsteps, and she ran harder than she had ever run in her life, not toward the cart, which felt suddenly too far and too exposed, but back toward the lit windows of the hall itself, toward the one place she knew she would be safe. She burst through the side door so suddenly that a footman nearly dropped the tray he was carrying, and she did not stop moving until she found Edward still in the library, a book open and forgotten in his lap, his expression shifting instantly from surprise to alarm at the sight of her. "Clara, what happened?" She told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than she could properly order them, and watched his face harden with each detail, his hands curling into fists against the arms of his chair. "He said that," Edward repeated quietly, when she reached the part about Charles's final words. "About you. I do not think he saw my face. I do not think he knows for certain it was me. That is not a risk I am willing to take." Edward stood, already moving toward the door, already calling for Peter in a voice that carried the full weight of his authority for the first time since Clara had known him. "You will not leave this house tonight, not until I know exactly what danger you may be in." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself, but the truth was that fear had settled into her bones in a way she had never experienced before, and some part of her, however reluctant, was grateful not to have to face the dark road alone. Charles was gone by morning, his departure sudden and unexplained, and though Edward sent men to question the stranger and search the roads, both had vanished as though they had never existed at all. Peter's inquiries turned up nothing but rumors, whispers of a man matching the stranger's description, seen boarding a coach bound for London, and the trail went cold within days. But something had shifted between Edward and Clara in the aftermath of that night, something neither of them tried to hide any longer. He found her in the garden a week later, sitting on the same stone bench where they had first spoken properly after the accident, and he did not sit beside her right away. He simply stood, watching her for a long moment until she looked up and caught the expression on his face. "I have been trying to find the right words for several days," he said, "and I find I do not have them, so I will simply say what I mean plainly, since you have always seemed to prefer plain things." Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she said nothing, waiting. "I do not wish to spend my life wondering what it would be like to have you beside me instead of imagining it," Edward said. "I have known many people in my life who wanted things from me, my title, my land, my name. I do not believe you have ever wanted any of those things, and that has made you the only person I have fully trusted since my father died." "Edward." "I am not finished," he said, though gently. "I am asking you to marry me, Clara, not out of gratitude, though I owe you my life twice over, not out of convenience, though God knows nothing about this has been convenient. I am asking because I cannot imagine facing whatever comes next, whoever is trying to harm me, without you standing beside me facing it too." Clara sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through 100 reasons why this could not possibly be simple, why her own past, the one she had spent so many years carefully burying, might rise up and ruin everything he was offering her. But looking at his face, at the raw honesty in his eyes, she found she could not make herself refuse him. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like stepping off solid ground into deep water all over again, frightening and inevitable at once. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gently, as though she were something he was still afraid might slip away, and for one bright, unguarded moment, Clara allowed herself to believe that the danger circling them might finally be behind them. She did not yet know that the Dowager Duchess, quietly and without a single word to either of them, had already begun writing letters of her own, seeking answers about the Bennet family that would reach her within the week, answers that would unravel everything Clara had spent a lifetime trying to keep buried. She did not know that somewhere in London, Charles Ashworth had found a piece of information far more dangerous to Clara than any cut saddle strap or broken bridge could ever be. And she did not know that the happiest moment of her life so far was about to be followed, in a matter of days, by the hardest one. The betrothal dinner was meant to be a quiet affair, family only, A small announcement before the formal engagement was made public to the county. Instead, it became the night everything Clara had built came apart. The Dowager Duchess arrived at the table with a folder of papers tucked beneath her arm, and though she said nothing as the first courses were served, Clara noticed the way Margaret's eyes kept returning to her, assessing, calculating, in a manner far colder than mere disapproval. It was over the second course that the Dowager finally spoke. "I have been curious about your family for some time, Miss Bennet," she said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "Your father in particular, Henry Bennet. It is an unusual thing, is it not, for a tenant farmer to speak with the manners and education of a man raised far above that station?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face, though she kept her voice steady. "My father worked hard for what education he has." "Did he?" The Dowager opened the folder before her, drawing out a single sheet of paper, and set it on the table where the candlelight caught the ink clearly enough for everyone to read. "I ask because 11 years ago, this estate employed a steward named Henry Carter, a trusted man, given full authority over the accounts, right up until nearly £40,000 went missing from the estate ledgers, and Henry Carter vanished the very same week, along with his wife and daughter." The room went utterly silent. "Henry Carter," the Dowager continued, her eyes never leaving Clara's face, "changed his name to Bennet, moved his family 3 counties away, took up farming on land he had never worked before in his life. It took my solicitors some time to trace the connection, but the resemblance in the handwriting alone was unmistakable once I knew to look for it. Your father, Miss Bennet, stole from this family, from this very house. And you have been sitting at our table for months, allowing my son to fall in love with you, without a single word of warning." Clara's hands had gone numb in her lap. "I did not know the full truth until I was 12 years old," she said, her voice barely steady. "I did not seek your son out. I did not know who he was when I pulled him from that river. I have spent 11 years living with the shame of what my father did, without ever once benefiting from a single coin of it." "That may well be true," the Dowager said, though her tone made clear how little the distinction mattered to her. "But the truth remains the truth. Your father brought this family to the edge of ruin, and you have brought yourself into the middle of it once again." Edward had not spoken through any of this, and when Clara finally turned to him, desperate for something, anything, in his expression that might steady her, she found only shock, raw and unguarded, his face gone the color of old paper. "Edward," she said softly. "Is it true?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, quieter and more painful than shouting could ever have been. "Your father is Henry Carter." "Yes," Clara said, because there was nothing else to say, no clever deflection left to hide behind. "Yes, it's true." "And you knew. This whole time you knew, and you never told me." "I did not know how," she said, the words breaking apart as she spoke them. "How could I have told you that my father ruined your family in the same breath as telling you that I loved you? I was afraid, Edward. I was afraid of exactly this moment." "You let me propose to you," he said, rising from his chair, his hands braced against the table as though he needed it to stay upright. "You let me stand in that garden and tell you that you were the only person I trusted, and the entire time you were hiding the one thing that would have changed everything. It would not have changed how I feel about you." "It has already changed how I feel about you," Edward said, and though his voice did not rise, the words landed harder than any shout could have. "Not because of what your father did. I do not blame you for his crimes, but because you let me believe I knew you completely, when in truth there was a wall between us the entire time, built from a secret you chose, every single day, not to share." Clara had no answer for that, because some deep and honest part of her knew he was right, knew that fear had made her a poor partner to the honesty he had always shown her. "I need time," Edward said quietly, and he left the table without another word, without looking back, and Clara sat frozen in her chair while the dowager watched her with an expression that held, beneath the coldness, something almost like pity. "You should have told him yourself," Margaret said, not unkindly. "Secrets discovered are always worse than secrets confessed." Clara left the hall that night without waiting for a carriage, walking the long dark road home in the cold, her thoughts a chaos of grief and shame, and a fear so large it felt like drowning all over again. Except this time there was no current to blame, no flood to point to, only her own silence, which she now understood had been its own kind of danger all along. Her father was waiting up when she arrived, sitting at the kitchen table exactly as he had been the day the Duke's first letter arrived, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "She found out," he said quietly. "It was not a question. You should have told me sooner. You should have told me the whole truth, not just enough to make me afraid of it." Henry Bennett's face aged years in the space of a single breath. "I was trying to protect you, Clara, from the shame of it, from exactly this." "Your protection has cost me everything," Clara said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, though she did not take them back, because in that moment, standing in the small kitchen that had been her whole world for 11 years, she felt the full weight of a lie that had never truly been hers, but that she had carried and compounded anyway, out of fear. "Tell me the truth now," she said, sitting across from him at the table. "All of it. I deserve that much, even if it is 11 years too late." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded before him, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that told Clara this was a story he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times, without ever finding the courage to say it aloud. "I did not steal the money," he said. "Not all of it, and not the way they believe. There was a second man involved, someone with far more to gain from a scandal that would ruin me and clear his own path forward. I discovered what he was doing too late, and when I tried to expose him, I found the evidence had already been rearranged to point to me instead. I ran because I did not believe I would receive a fair hearing against a man with far more power and far better connections than a steward's word could match." Clara stared at her father, the pieces shifting and rearranging in her mind. Who was the other man? Henry Bennett's face went pale in the lamplight. "I do not know his given name, only that he was young then, ambitious, and deeply resentful of a cousin who had inherited what he believed should have been his own." The room seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. "Charles," she whispered. Her father's silence was answer enough. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table long after her father had gone to bed, turning the truth over in her mind, until the pieces finally clicked into place with a clarity that frightened her more than any river current ever had. Charles Ashworth had not simply opposed Edward out of old resentment over the title. 11 years earlier, he had stolen from his own family, framed an honest steward to cover his tracks, and watched an innocent man flee in disgrace rather than face a trial he could not win. And now, with Edward's inheritance standing between him and the fortune he believed was owed to him, Charles had returned to finish what he had started, this time by removing Edward from the world entirely. She needed to reach Edward, not to plead for forgiveness, though her heart still ached with the need for it, but to warn him, because whatever had happened between them, whatever wall her silence had built, she could not let him walk unknowingly into danger from a man who had already proven he would go to any length to get what he wanted. She rode for the hall before the sun had fully risen, borrowing the neighbor's horse again, urging it faster than she had ever dared before. She arrived to chaos. Peter met her at the gate, his face white with worry, words spilling out of him faster than she could follow. Edward had ridden out at dawn, alone, refusing an escort, needing air and distance after the previous night. He had told no one which direction he intended to go. And Charles Ashworth had returned to the estate sometime in the early hours, unseen by anyone, until a stable groom reported him riding out shortly after Edward, moving fast, moving purposefully, in the same direction his cousin had gone. Clara did not wait to hear the rest. She turned her horse and rode for the one place she knew Edward was most likely to seek solitude, the one place that had started everything between them in the first place. The river. She found him exactly where she expected, standing on the new bridge that had been built to replace the one which had collapsed months before, staring down into water that ran calm now, nothing like the flood that had nearly killed him the day they met. He heard her horse and turned, his expression guarded, careful, the warmth she had grown used to still shadowed by the pain of the night before. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "You are in danger," she said, sliding off the horse before it had fully stopped, her chest heaving from the ride. "Charles rode out after you this morning. Edward, my father told me the truth last night. The money that vanished 11 years ago was never stolen by him. Charles took it and framed my father to hide his own crimes. He has been trying to remove you from Rothmere since before either of us were born, and I believe he intends to finish it today." Edward's face went very still. "You are certain of this?" "As certain as I can be without proof. But Edward, please, we need to leave this bridge. If he wanted to stage another accident, this is exactly the place he would choose." It was too late. Charles emerged from the tree line at the far end of the bridge, still mounted, his expression calm in a way that was far more frightening than anger would have been. "How touching," he said, walking his horse slowly onto the bridge, closing the distance between them with unhurried menace. "The farmer's daughter, riding to the rescue once again. Though I confess, cousin, I am somewhat relieved to have you both in the same place. It saves me a great deal of trouble." "Charles," Edward said, stepping slightly in front of Clara without seeming to think about it at all. "Whatever grievance you carry, we can discuss it like reasonable men. There is no need for this." "Reasonable men," Charles repeated and laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Reasonable men do not inherit titles they were never meant to hold, simply because an accident of birth placed them one branch closer to the trunk. I have watched you my entire life, Edward, given everything I was denied, treating it all as though it were owed to you rather than earned. I am done watching." He dismounted, and Clara saw, with a jolt of fear, the pistol tucked into his belt, half hidden beneath his coat. "You cut the saddle strap," Edward said, his voice steady despite the danger closing in around them. "You weakened the bridge. You have been trying to kill me for months." "And I would have succeeded if not for her." Charles's gaze cut to Clara, cold and assessing. "You have been remarkably inconvenient, Miss Bennet, or should I say, Miss Carter, your father's daughter through and through, always noticing things that were never meant to be noticed." "You framed my father," Clara said, anger overtaking her fear. "You destroyed his life to protect your own crime." "A necessary sacrifice," Charles said, with a shrug that made Clara's blood boil. "Nothing personal in it. He was simply the man in the way, as you both are now." He drew the pistol, and everything after that happened faster than Clara could fully track, a blur of motion and sound. Edward moved to shield her, Charles's arm swung toward them, and Clara, without thinking, without any plan beyond the simple instinct to save the man she loved for a third time, threw herself against Edward's side, knocking them both sideways just as the pistol fired. The shot went wide, striking the wooden railing of the bridge instead of flesh, splinters flying into the morning air. Charles cursed, fumbling to reload, and in the chaos of the moment, Edward surged forward, tackling his cousin before he could raise the weapon a second time. The two men grappled at the edge of the bridge, dangerously close to the water below, and Clara scrambled to her feet, searching desperately for anything she could use to help, her eyes landing on a fallen branch near the bank. She snatched it up and ran back onto the bridge just as Charles managed to twist free of Edward's grip, raising the reloaded pistol once more. She swung the branch with everything she had. It connected with Charles's arm just as the pistol fired a second time, throwing his aim wide once again, the bullet splintering into the water far below. The pistol clattered from his grip, sliding across the wooden planks, and before he could recover, Edward was on him again, pinning him hard against the bridge railing. "It is over, Charles," Edward said, breathing hard, his voice edged with a fury Clara had never heard from him before. "It has been over since the moment you decided a farmer's daughter was too clever for your plans." Charles struggled a moment longer, then went still, the fight draining out of him all at once, replaced by a bitterness that seemed to settle into every line of his face. "You will never prove any of it," he spat. "Your word against mine, and my family's name carries as much weight as yours." "I do not need your confession," Edward said. "I have your pistol, fired twice at both of us, in front of a witness. I have a stranger seen boarding a coach in London, who I imagine will be far less loyal to you once questioned properly by men with real authority. And I have 11 years of ledgers that my mother, I suspect, will now be very interested in examining with fresh eyes." Peter arrived minutes later with several of the estate's men, summoned by a groom who had seen Clara riding out at dangerous speed, and grown worried enough to raise the alarm. Charles was bound and taken back to the hall under guard, his protests growing quieter with every step, the weight of 11 years finally catching up to him in a single, unraveling morning. It was only once the immediate danger had passed, once Charles had been led away and the bridge stood empty and quiet again beneath the climbing sun, that Edward turned to Clara, both of them still breathing hard, both of them shaking with the aftermath of what had nearly happened. "You saved my life again," he said quietly. "I could not simply stand by, not after everything." Clara's voice broke slightly. "I know you have every reason to still be angry with me. I know my silence hurt you in a way I cannot undo simply by warning you of danger. But Edward, I could not let you walk into it unprotected, whatever you decide about us." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the morning light, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the hard edge of the night before, replaced by something gentler, something that sounded cautiously like hope. "I spent the night thinking about what my mother said," he admitted. "That secrets discovered are worse than secrets confessed, and she was right in a way, though not the way she intended. Your secret was never truly yours to confess, Clara. It was your father's shame, carried onto your shoulders through no fault of your own, and you spent 11 years believing you had to hide it simply to be loved. I should have trusted you with it sooner." "You should have," he agreed. "But I understand now, standing here, why you didn't. Fear does not always make wise choices. It only makes safe ones. And I would rather have a wife who is occasionally too afraid to speak than one who was never brave enough to pull me out of a river in the first place." Clara felt tears she had been holding back all night finally spill over, and Edward crossed the distance between them and pulled her close, both of them still muddy and shaking from the fight, neither of them caring in the slightest. "Marry me still," he said against her hair. "Not because I am obligated by gratitude, and not because we have survived something terrible together, though we have. Marry me because I have thought of nothing but you since the day you dragged me out of that water, and I do not intend to spend one more day pretending otherwise." "Yes," Clara said again, the word easier this time than it had been the first, steadier, truer. "Yes, Edward." The investigation into Charles Ashworth's crimes took the better part of the following months, but the evidence, once properly examined, left little room for doubt. The stranger from London was found and questioned, his testimony confirming every detail Henry Bennet had shared that difficult night in the farmhouse kitchen. The old ledgers, re-examined by solicitors with fresh instructions from the Dowager herself, revealed discrepancies that had been carefully hidden for over a decade, patterns that pointed unmistakably away from Henry and directly toward his accuser. Charles was tried, quietly, to protect what remained of the family name, and sent away to answer for his crimes in a manner that ensured he would trouble no one again. Henry Bennet's name was formally cleared, the stolen years given back to him in the only way the law could offer, though Clara knew, watching her father read the official letter with hands that trembled slightly, that some wounds ran too deep for paper to fully heal. Still, something in him eased that day. Some old weight finally set down after 11 long years of carrying it in silence. Margaret Ashworth, to everyone's surprise but perhaps her own, was the one who insisted the wedding be held at the hall itself, in the same garden where Edward had first proposed. She never fully warmed into open affection, not in the way Clara might once have hoped, but there was respect in the way she addressed Clara after the trial concluded, a grudging acknowledgment earned through months of proof rather than mere words. "You are not what I expected," the dowager said, on the morning of the wedding, watching Clara dress in white silk that had once belonged to Edward's own mother. "I confess I am glad to have been wrong." "I did not need you to be glad, Your Grace, only fair." "Fairness and gladness are not always the same thing," Margaret said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "But today I believe I manage both." The ceremony was small, held beneath the same oak tree that marked the family crest, attended by servants who had watched Clara's visits grow from cautious to certain over the course of a single eventful year. Henry Bennet walked his daughter down the garden path with his head held high for the first time in over a decade, and Edward waited for her beneath the old oak with an expression that held nothing hidden, nothing guarded, only plain and open joy. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask about the crooked white scar on her father's ribs, the one he never fully explained beyond a quiet smile, Clara would take her down to the river that ran along the edge of their land, the same river that had once nearly taken Edward from her before their story had even properly begun. She would teach her daughter to swim in its slow summer currents, patient and careful, the way her own mother had once taught her. And when her daughter asked, breathless and curious, whether the river was dangerous, Clara would smile and say that rivers do not care whose fault anything is. They only carry you toward wherever you are meant to go, whether you are ready for the journey or not. Somewhere behind them, on the hill overlooking the water, Edward Ashworth would watch his wife and daughter with the same quiet wonder he had felt the very first time Clara Bennet pulled him from that same current, and think, not for the first time, that the worst day of his life had somehow also become the very best one.